From the art of Africa to your screen, this is Raw Tales Africa, where every story cuts deep. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. The tension in the old church hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Pastor Adebayo stood behind the podium, his face flushed red with anger, pointing an accusing finger at a small boy sitting in the back row. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his voice echoing off the cracked walls. "This is a house of God, not a shelter for street rats." 7-year-old Tade Adewale sat frozen in the wooden pew, his torn shirt hanging loosely on his thin frame. Around him, the congregation of St. Matthew's Anglican Church murmured their agreement. Some nodded vigorously, others whispered among themselves, but none stood up for the child. "Pastor is right," said Mrs. Folake, the church treasurer, her expensive gele wobbling as she shook her head in disgust. "The boy smells like the gutter. He is disturbing our worship." Tade's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't move. He had walked 3 miles in the rain just to attend Sunday service, his bare feet bleeding from the rough roads. All he wanted was to hear about the God who loves everyone, especially the broken. "Get out!" Pastor Adebayo's voice boomed again. "And don't come back until you can dress properly and contribute something to this church." The boy stood up slowly, his small hands clutching a piece of paper, a drawing he had made of Jesus feeding the 5,000. He had planned to give it as an offering since he had no money. As he walked down the aisle, every eye in the church followed him. Some faces showed disgust, others indifference, but no one showed mercy. At the door, Tade turned back one last time. "I will come back," he whispered, so quietly that only God could hear. "And when I do, things will be different." But this story actually started 20 years earlier, when a baby was left at the gates of this very same church. The year was 1985, and Nigeria was struggling through one of its hardest economic downtimes. Unemployment was rampant, and even the middle class found themselves skipping meals. It was during this time that a young woman, barely 18, stood outside St. Matthew's Anglican Church with a bundle in her arms. The baby inside the worn cloth was barely 3 months old. His mother, Aduni, had no choice. She was a house girl who had been thrown out by her madam after becoming pregnant. The father, a married man who worked in the government, had denied any responsibility. "Please, God," she whispered through her tears, "let them take care of him. Let him have a better life than I can give him." She placed the baby at the church gate with a small note. "His name is Tade. Please, love him as God loves us all. I will return for him when I can." But Aduni never returned. 3 days later, she was found dead by the roadside, struck by a speeding vehicle while trying to find work in the city. Pastor Adebayo, then a young and ambitious clergyman, found the baby during his morning walk. He read the note and sighed heavily. The church was already struggling financially, and another mouth to feed was not what they needed. "What should we do with him, Pastor?" asked Deacon Johnson, a kind-hearted man who had arrived with his wife for morning prayers. Pastor Adebayo looked at the baby, then at the church building that needed so many repairs, the leaking roof, the cracked walls, the broken pews. He made a decision that would define the next 2 decades. "We'll keep him," he said finally, "but he must earn his keep. The church is not a charity." And so began Tade's life at St. Matthew's Anglican Church. He was raised not as a beloved child of God, but as a burden to be tolerated. By the time he was 7, Tade had learned to sweep the church grounds, clean the toilets, and serve during church functions. He slept on a mat in the church storeroom, among old hymn books and broken furniture. His meals were left over from church events when there were any. The boy never complained. He attended every service, listened to every sermon, and believed with all his heart that somewhere in those words about love and compassion, there was hope for him too. But the congregation saw only his poverty, his worn clothes, his quiet desperation, and they were embarrassed by it. Mrs. Folake, who had married into wealth and now served as the church treasurer, was particularly cruel. That boy is a distraction, she would tell anyone who would listen. People come here to worship, not to be reminded of society's failures. Chief Bankole, the chairman of the church board, agreed. A successful businessman who had built his fortune through questionable means. He believed the church should cater to people like him, those who could afford to give generously. If we want to attract the right kind of members, he often said, we need to maintain certain standards. The Sunday when everything changed started like any other. Tade had woken at 5 a.m. to sweep the church compound, arrange the chairs, and prepare for the morning service. He had found a few naira notes that someone had dropped the previous day, and he carefully placed them in the offering box, imagining the smile on Pastor Adebayo's face when he discovered the unexpected gift. The service began as usual. The choir sang, the congregation clapped, and Pastor Adebayo preached about prosperity and blessings for the faithful. Tade sat in his usual spot at the back, wearing his only good shirt, a faded blue thing that was 2 sizes too big. Everything was fine until the communion service began. Mrs. Folake, who was helping to serve the communion wine, noticed Tade walking toward the altar with the other congregants. He quickly whispered to the pastor, gesturing frantically toward the boy. Pastor Adebayo's face darkened. He had been having a difficult week. The church's biggest donor had threatened to withdraw his support unless the church improved its image. Several wealthy members had complained about the inappropriate elements in the congregation. When Tade reached the altar, Pastor Adebayo placed his hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, stopping him. Communion is for contributing members of the church, he announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. This is the body and blood of Christ, not food for those who cannot even afford proper clothes. The church fell silent. Tade looked up at the pastor with confusion and hurt in his eyes. But, Pastor, the boy said softly, Jesus said, come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden. Don't quote scripture to me, boy, Pastor Adebayo snapped. You are not a member of this church. You are a charity case we have tolerated out of kindness. Know your place. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Chief Bankole nodded approvingly. Mrs. Folake smiled smugly. Even the choir members turned away, embarrassed to be associated with the scene. Only one person spoke up, Mrs. Adebimpe, an elderly widow who cleaned offices for a living, stood up from her seat. Pastor, that is not right, she said, her voice trembling. That boy has served this church faithfully. He has more faith than most of us here. Sit down, Mama Debimpe, Pastor Adebayo commanded. You are almost as poor as he is. What do either of you know about running a church? The insult hit its mark. Mrs. Adebimpe sat down, tears in her eyes. Tade stood at the altar for a moment longer, then quickly walked back to his seat. But the damage was done. Word of the incident spread quickly through the community. By evening, everyone knew that the boy who lived at the church had been publicly humiliated during communion. That night, Tade knelt by his mat in the storeroom and prayed with tears streaming down his face. God, why did you let them treat me like this? I have done everything they asked. I have never complained. I have tried to be good, but they don't want me here. He looked at the drawing he had made, Jesus feeding the multitudes, welcoming everyone regardless of their status. In the picture, even the poor children were sitting at the front, smiling as they received their blessing. Maybe, he whispered, maybe they are right. Maybe I don't belong here, but one day, God, one day I want to build a church where everyone is welcome, where no child is made to feel ashamed for being poor. It was a prayer that would echo in his heart for the next 20 years. The month following the communion incidents brought a series of increasingly cruel treatments. It was as if Pastor Adebayo's public humiliation of Tade had given the entire congregation permission to treat the boy as less than human. The first major incident happened during the church harvest festival. Wealthy members brought bags of rice, yams, and expensive gifts to display at the altar. Tade, who had been helping with the decorations, accidentally knocked over a basket of oranges while trying to hang a banner. Clumsy fool, shouted Chief Bankole, rushing to save his expensive fruits. Look what you have done. The oranges scattered across the floor, some rolling under the pews. Tade immediately dropped to his knees, frantically trying to collect them. I am sorry, sir, he stammered. I didn't mean to. Sorry doesn't pay for my losses. Chief Bankole cut him off. He turned to Pastor Adebayo, who was watching from the pulpit. Pastor, this boy is becoming a liability. Every time we have an important event, it causes problems. Mrs. Folake never want to miss an opportunity to humiliate Tade, added her voice to the complaint. Chief is right. Last week, I saw him wearing a shirt that had holes in it during the women's meeting. Sister Boniface, who was visiting from the mainland, asked if we run an orphanage here. I was so embarrassed. Pastor Adebayo nodded gravely. Tade, he called out, his voice echoing in the church hall. Come here. The boy stood up, his small hands still clutching two oranges. He walked slowly toward the altar, aware that every eye in the church was on him. From now on, Pastor Adebayo announced, you will not be allowed in the main church during services or events. You can listen from the back room, but you are not to be seen by our members or visitors. The words hit Tade like physical blows. He had been officially banished from the house of God. But, Pastor, he whispered, where will I sit during Sunday service? Figure it out, Pastor Adebayo replied coldly, and clean up this mess you have made. As Tade knelt to pick up the remaining oranges, he could hear the whispered conversations around him. Finally, someone did something about that boy. I was getting tired of seeing him sitting there like he belonged. The church will look so much better now. But there was one voice that stood out from the rest. Mrs. Adebimpe, the elderly widow, was crying softly in her seat. When Tade looked up, their eyes met, and she muttered silently, I am sorry, my child. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later, during a special visit from the Anglican bishop. Pastor Adebayo had been preparing for months, hoping to impress the high-ranking church official and possibly earn a promotion to a larger parish. Tade, who had been instructed to stay completely out of sight, was cleaning the bathroom when he heard commotion outside. Through the small window, he could see the bishop's convoy arriving, three black cars with church flags. The bishop, a dignified man in his 60s, stepped out of the lead car and was immediately surrounded by Pastor Adebayo and the church's leadership. They were all dressed in their finest clothes, smiling and bowing as they welcomed their distinguished visitor. As the group walked toward the church entrance, disaster struck. A strong wind blew through the compound, scattering the carefully arranged welcome decorations. Papers flew everywhere, and the beautiful banner that read, "Welcome, Bishop Adeyemi," was torn from his moorings. Without thinking, Tade rushed out of the bathroom to help. He ran across the compound, catching papers and trying to secure the loose decorations. In his mind, he was helping to ensure that the bishop's visit would be perfect. But to Pastor Adebayo and the church leadership, Tade's sudden appearance was a nightmare. Here was the boy they had specifically hidden, running around in his torn clothes while they were trying to make their best impression. Get that boy out of here, hissed Chief Bankole, but it was too late. Bishop Adeyemi had noticed the commotion and was watching Tade with interest. "Who is that young man?" he asked. Pastor Adebayo's face went pale. "Oh, Bishop, he helps with cleaning." "He seems very dedicated," the bishop observed, watching as Tade carefully straightened a fallen flower arrangement. "I'm very quick to help when needed." "Yes," Pastor Adebayo stammered. "Well, we should go inside now. The congregation is waiting." But the damage was done. Throughout the bishop's visit, Pastor Adebayo was distracted and nervous, constantly worried that Tade might appear again. His sermon was disjointed, and he fumbled through the presentation he had practiced for weeks. After the bishop left, Pastor Adebayo's anger was volcanic. "You stupid boy," he screamed at Tade. "Do you know what you have done? You have ruined everything." "I was just trying to help," Tade said quietly. "Help?" Pastor Adebayo laughed bitterly. "You have probably cost me my promotion. The bishop thinks we are running some kind of charity operation here." Mrs. Folake, who had also been embarrassed by the incident, joined the attack. "That boy is cursed," she declared. "Everything he touches turns to disaster. I am telling you, Pastor, he is bad luck for this church." The congregation, which had gathered to hear about the bishop's visits, murmured their agreement. In their minds, Tade had become the scapegoat for every problem the church faced. That night, as punishment for his disobedience, Tade was locked out of the church building. He spent the night under the mango tree in the compound, shivering from the cold and wondering why God allowed such things to happen. The third incident was the cruelest of all. It happened during the church's annual children's program, a special event where the young members would perform songs and recitations for their parents. Tade, now 8 years old, had been watching from the window of the storeroom as the other children practiced their performances. His heart ached with longing to be part of something so joyful. Mrs. Adebimpe, who taught the Sunday school classes, had noticed Tade watching. Despite the risk, she approached him one evening after the other children had gone home. "Tade," she said gently, "would you like to learn a song for the children's program?" The boy's eyes lit up like stars. "Really, Mama Debimpe, I can participate. We'll practice in secret, she whispered. And maybe, just maybe, you can surprise everyone with how beautiful your voice is. For 2 weeks, Mrs. Adebimpe secretly taught Tade a hymn called Jesus Loves the Little Children. The boy had a naturally beautiful voice, clear and sweet, and he memorized every word with enthusiasm. The night of the children's program, the church was packed with proud parents and relatives. The young performers sang and danced, each receiving applause and encouragement from the audience. Near the end of the program, Mrs. Adebimpe made a move. She stood up and announced, "We have one more special performance tonight. A young man who has shown tremendous faith and dedication to our church." Before anyone could stop her, she called out, "Tade, come and share your song with us." The church fell silent as Tade emerged from the back room. He was wearing his cleanest shirt and had combed his hair as neatly as possible. His face was glowing with excitement and nervousness. Pastor Adebayo's face turned red with fury, but with the church full of visitors, he couldn't create a scene immediately. Tade walked to the front and began to sing, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world." His voice was pure and beautiful, carrying clearly throughout the church. For a moment, the congregation was mesmerized. Some parents wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the innocence and faith in the boy's performance. But the spell was quickly broken by Mrs. Falake's harsh voice. "What is this nonsense? That boy doesn't belong on this stage." Chief Bankole stood up angrily. "Pastor, what is the meaning of this? We didn't come here to watch a street child perform." The mood in the church shifted immediately. Parents began to murmur complaints, saying their children shouldn't have to share the stage with that boy. Some even suggested that Tade's presence had contaminated their children's performances. Pastor Adebayo had heard enough. He strode to the front of the church, his face dark with rage. "That is enough," he shouted, cutting off Tade mid-song. "Get down from there immediately." Tade stopped singing, confusion and hurt in his eyes. The applause he had hoped for never came. Instead, he was met with angry faces and harsh whispers. "You had no right to put that boy on stage," Pastor Adebayo said to Mrs. Adebimpe, his voice cold as ice. "And you," he pointed at Tade, "you will pay for this embarrassment." As Tade walked off the stage, his head hung in shame, Mrs. Adebimpe stood up from her seat. "That boy has more faith in his little finger than this entire congregation has in their hearts," she said loudly. "You should be ashamed of yourselves for treating a child this way." "Sit down, woman," Chibankole shouted, "or leave this church right now." Mrs. Adebimpe looked around at the faces of the congregation, people she had worshipped with for years, people she had considered family. She saw no compassion, no mercy, no Christ-like love. "You know what?" she said, standing up and gathering her belongings. "I think I will leave. This is no longer a house of God. It has become a den of hypocrites." As she walked toward the exit, she paused beside Tade, who was standing at the back of the church with tears streaming down his face. "Don't let them break your spirits, my child," she whispered. "God sees everything and he has a plan for you." With that, Mrs. Adebimpe walked out of St. Matthew's Anglican Church, never to return. The final straw came 3 months later, on a rainy Sunday morning that would forever change the trajectory of Tade's life. The church was preparing for its annual fundraising campaign to repair the roof, which had been leaking for years. Pastor Adebayo had invited several wealthy potential donors to attend the service, hoping to impress them with the church's refined membership. Among the invited guests was Alhaji Musa, a Muslim businessman who was considering making a substantial donation to the church as part of his community service. Also present was Mrs. Williams, a wealthy widow from Victoria Island who was known for her charitable contributions to religious organizations. Tade, now 9 years old and increasingly aware of his unwelcome status, had been trying to stay completely invisible. He had learned to time his movements clearly, avoiding the main areas when services or meetings were taking place. But that morning, fate had other plans. The rain had been falling heavily since dawn, and the old roof was leaking worse than ever. Water was dripping into the church hall in several places, and Pastor Adebayo was becoming increasingly anxious about the impression this would make on his important guests. Someone needs to do something about those leaks, he muttered to Deacon Johnson. This is a disaster. Deacon Johnson, who had always been kinder to Tade than the others, suggested, maybe we should ask the boy to help. He knows this building better than anyone, and he is good at fixing things. Pastor Adebayo reluctantly agreed, but with strict instructions. Tell him to be quick and quiet, and for God's sake, make sure he stays out of sight of our guests. Tade was summoned from the storeroom and given a bucket and some old rags. His task was to catch the dripping water and clean up the puddles without disturbing the service. He moved through the church like a ghost, placing buckets strategically and mopping up water as quietly as possible. The wealthy guests never even noticed him walking in the shadows. Everything was going according to plan until the largest leak, directly above the altar, suddenly worsened. A steady stream of dirty water began pouring down, threatening to flood the area where the communion table stood. Tade knew he had to act fast. He grabbed a large bucket and climbed onto a chair, trying to position it to catch the flowing water. But the chair was old and unstable, and as he reached up to secure the bucket, disaster struck. The chair collapsed beneath him, sending Tade tumbling toward the communion table. In his desperation to avoid destroying the sacred items, he grabbed onto the altar cloth, which tore away in his hands as he fell. The crash was tremendous. Tade hit the floor hard. The bucket clanked loudly as it bounced across the tiles, and the beautiful white altar cloth was torn and stained with dirty water. The entire congregation turned to stare at the scene. The wealthy guests gasped in shock. Pastor Adebayo's face went from pale to bright red in seconds. But the worst part was yet to come. As Tade struggled to get up, his one shirt tore further, revealing the thin, malnourished body beneath. His bleeding knee left spots of blood on the white cloth he was still clutching. What have you done? Pastor Adebayo's voice boomed through the church like thunder. The service came to a complete halt. Every eye was on Tade as he stood there, injured and humiliated, holding the torn altar cloth. Mrs. Folake was the first to speak, her voice dripping with disgust. Look at what that boy has done. He has defiled the altar. Chief Bankole jumped up from his seat, his face contorted with rage. This is sacrilege. That dirty street child has contaminated the Holy Communion table. The wealthy guests were whispering among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they had witnessed. Alhaji Musa was shaking his head in disapproval while Mrs. Williams was gathering her purse, preparing to leave. Pastor Adebayo saw his carefully planned fundraising campaign crumbling before his eyes. All his hopes for impressing the donors were destroyed by this one moment of chaos. "You ungrateful wretch!" he screamed at Tade, his voice echoing off the walls. "After everything we have done for you, this is how you repay us?" Tade tried to explain, his voice small and shaking. "Pastor, I was trying to stop the leak. I didn't mean to." "Silence!" Pastor Adebayo cut him off. "You have brought shame and defilement into God's house." The congregation was now in full uproar. Voices rose from every corner. "He has cursed this church. We should never have allowed him to stay. This is what happens when you try to help street children. He has brought bad luck to us all." Mrs. Folake stood up, her jewelry jangling as she pointed an accusing finger at Tade. "Pastor, this boy has been nothing but trouble since day one. Today he has finally shown his true nature. He is a destroyer, a curse upon this holy place." Chief Bankole nodded vigorously. "She is right. Look at our guests. They are horrified. This boy has cost us thousands of naira in potential donations. Even the choir members who had always ignored Tade joined in the condemnation. We can't have him here anymore. He is disrupting the house of God. This is the last straw." Pastor Adebayo raised his hand for silence. His decision already made. The pressure from the congregation, the embarrassment in front of the donors, and years of frustration with Tade's presence had finally reached a breaking point. "Tade Adewale," he said, his voice cold and final, "you are no longer welcome in this church." The words hit the boy like physical blows. He staggered backward, still clutching the torn altar cloth. "Pack your things and leave immediately," Pastor Adebayo continued. "And don't ever come back. You have proven that you don't belong in the house of God." Tears streamed down Tade's face as he looked around the church, the only home he had ever known. These people had raised him, fed him, sheltered him, and now they were casting him out like a common criminal. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I have nowhere else to go." "That is not our problem," Mrs. Folake said harshly. "You should have thought about that before you defiled our altar." "The streets are where you belong," Chief Bankole added. "That's where you came from, and that's where you should return." As Tade stood there, broken and rejected, something unexpected happened. From the back of the church, a small voice spoke up. "This is wrong." Everyone turned to see who had dared to defend the boy. It was Bisi, a 12-year-old girl whose mother was one of the church's cleaners. She had always been quiet, never speaking unless spoken to, but now she stood up with tears in her eyes. "Jesus said, 'Suffer the little children to come unto me,'" she said, her voice growing stronger. "How can we call ourselves Christians and throw out a child who has nowhere to go?" "Sit down, Bisi," her mother eased, embarrassed by her daughter's outburst. But Bisi continued, "My Sunday school teacher told us that Jesus was homeless too, and that angels sometimes come to us in the form of strangers and children. What if—" "Enough!" Pastor Adebayo shouted. "One more word, and your family will join him outside." The threat was clear, and Bisi's mother quickly pulled her daughter back into her seat. But the girl's words had planted a seed of doubt in some hearts. However, it was too late for mercy. The congregation's bloodlust had been awakened and they wanted Tade gone. Go, Pastor Adebayo commanded. Leave now before I call the police. Tade looked around one last time at the faces of the people who had been his entire world. He saw anger, disgust, embarrassment, and indifference, but no compassion, no love, no mercy. He dropped the torn altar cloth and walked slowly toward the back of the church, where his few belongings were stored. As he gathered his things, a small bag with two shirts, a pair of shorts, and a warm Bible, the congregation continued their harsh judgment. Good riddance. Finally, our church can be respectable again. He has brought us nothing but shame. But as Tade reached the door, he turned back one final time. His young voice, clear and strong despite his tears, carried throughout the silent church. One day, he said, looking directly at Pastor Adebayo, I will return to build a church where no child is ever turned away, where the poor are welcomed and the broken are healed. And when that day comes, you will remember this moment and know that God sees everything. With that prophecy hanging in the air, 9-year-old Tade Adewale walked out of St. Matthew's Anglican Church and into the streets of Lagos, carrying nothing but a small bag, a wounded heart, and an unshakable faith in a God who loved him even when his people didn't. Behind him, the church doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing his faith and beginning a journey that would take 20 years to complete. The streets of Lagos in 1994 were no place for a 9-year-old boy, but Tade had no choice. With his small bag slung over his shoulder and tears still wet on his cheeks, he walked away from the only home he had ever known, not knowing where his next meal would come from or where he would sleep at night. For the first week, he survived by begging at bus stops and markets, sleeping in doorways and under bridges. The city was harsh and unforgiving, especially to a child with no family, no connections, and no street experience. But Tade's luck changed when he met Papa Taiwo, an elderly man who collected scrap metal and bottles for recycling. Papa Taiwo found Tade one morning, sick with fever and barely conscious, lying behind a mechanic's workshop in Mushin. Wetin you dey do here, small boy? Papa Taiwo asked in pidgin English, his weathered face creased with concern. When Tade told his story, Papa Taiwo's eyes filled with tears. He had been a Muslim all his life, but he couldn't understand how a church could throw away a child like garbage. Come with me, Papa Taiwo said simply. Nobody, no matter how small, should die for lack of care. Papa Taiwo lived in a small shack in one of Lagos' sprawling slums, but he shared what little he had with Tade. More importantly, he became the first adult to show the boy genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. Education na the only thing wey go save you, Papa Taiwo told Tade repeatedly. No matter wetin happen, make sure say you go school. Despite his poverty, Papa Taiwo enrolled Tade in a local public school, paying the fees with money he earned from his recycling work. The boy proved to be extraordinarily brilliant, often finishing at the top of his class despite studying by candlelight in their tiny shack. But Papa Taiwo's greatest gift to Tade wasn't education. It was the restoration of his faith in human goodness. Through Papa Taiwo's example, Tade learned that kindness wasn't limited to Christians, that God's love could be expressed through anyone willing to show compassion. The years passed quickly. Tade grew from a traumatized child into a determined teenager, driven by two powerful motivations: gratitude to Papa Taiwo and a burning desire to prove wrong those who had rejected him. When Tade was 16, Papa Taiwo felt seriously ill. The old man had been coughing for months, but he had ignored the symptoms, spending his money on Tade's education instead of medical care. Papa, we need to take you to the hospital, Tade pleaded as the old man grew weaker. No money for hospital, Papa Taiwo replied, his voice weak but determined. Use the money for your JAMB form. University na your ticket to better life. Tade was torn between his love for the man who had saved him and his dreams for higher education. But Papa Taiwo made the decision for him. Promise me something, Papa Taiwo whispered as he lay on his mat, struggling to breathe. When you become successful, remember where you come from. Help other people the way I help you. And no matter how high you rise, never forget say God dey watch everything. 3 days later, Papa Taiwo died in his sleep. Tade used the last of their savings to give the old man a decent burial, then found himself alone again at 16, but this time with a clear purpose. Tade's performance in his WAEC and JAMB examinations was outstanding. He won a scholarship to study architecture at the University of Lagos, a choice influenced by his childhood promise to build a better church. University life was challenging for someone from his background, but Tade's experiences had made him resilient. He worked part-time jobs to supplement his scholarship, studying late into the night and graduating with first-class honors. His final year project was a design for a community center that would serve as both a place of worship and a social service hub. His professors were impressed by the innovative design and the passion behind it, but they had no idea of the personal journey that had inspired it. After graduation, Tade was recruited by one of Nigeria's top architectural firms. His talent was immediately apparent, and he quickly rose through the ranks, working on prestigious projects across the country. But success in his career was only the first step in Tade's master plan. Every naira he earned, every connection he made, every skill he developed was carefully directed toward one ultimate goal: fulfilling the promise he had made as a broken 9-year-old boy. By his late 20s, Tade had established his own architectural firm, specializing in religious and community buildings. His designs were innovative, beautiful, and always included special provisions for serving the poor and the marginalized. He had also quietly begun a foundation that provided scholarships for orphan children, built homeless shelters, and supported struggling families. He never publicized his charitable work, preferring to operate behind the scenes, but throughout all his success, Tade never forgot St. Matthew's Anglican Church. He kept track of its activities through contacts in the community, watching from afar as the church continued to struggle with the same problems that had plagued it during his childhood. The building was still in poor condition, the roof still leaked, and the congregation was still small and exclusive. By 2014, 20 years after being cast out, Tade Adewale had become one of Nigeria's most successful architects. His firm, Adewale and Associates, had designed churches, mosques, schools, and community centers across West Africa. But his greatest project was still ahead of him. St. Matthew's Anglican Church was now in desperate condition. The congregation had dwindled to fewer than 30 regular members, most of them elderly. The building was literally falling apart. Large sections of the roof had collapsed, the foundation was cracked, and the local government had issued a demolition notice. Pastor Adebayo, now 67 and graying, was facing the greatest crisis of his ministry. The wealthy members who had once supported the church had moved to newer, more prestigious congregations. Chief Bankole had died 5 years earlier, and Mrs. Folake had relocated to Abuja with her children. The church's debts were mounting, and Pastor Adebayo knew they had less than 6 months before they would be forced to close permanently. It was during this desperate time that a miracle seemed to appear. A letter arrived at the church office, written on expensive letterhead from the Adewale Foundation. The letter was brief but stunning. Dear Pastor Adebayo, the Adewale Foundation has learned of your church's current difficulties. We would like to offer our assistance by completely rebuilding St. Matthew's Anglican Church at no cost to your congregation. Our only conditions are that the new church must welcome all people regardless of their economic status, and that a portion of the building must be dedicated to serving the poor and homeless in your community. If you agree to these terms, please respond within 30 days. Construction can begin immediately. Sincerely, the Adewale Foundation Board of Directors. Pastor Adebayo read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. A completely new church building, worth millions of naira, offered for free. It seemed too good to be true. He called an emergency meeting of the remaining church board members. The few elderly members who attended were equally stunned by the offer. "Who is this Adewale Foundation?" asked Deacon Johnson, now the senior deacon after Chief Bankole's death. "I have never heard of them," Pastor Adebayo replied, "but they seem legitimate. Look at this letterhead. It is expensive paper, professional printing." Sister Mary, who had taken over Mrs. Folake's role as treasurer, was more cautious. "What about these conditions? Welcoming all people regardless of economic status, serving the poor. That could bring in all sorts of undesirable elements." Pastor Adebayo thought about the demolition notice sitting on his desk. They had no other options. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "If we don't accept this offer, we'll have no church at all." The vote was unanimous. Pastor Adebayo sent his acceptance letter the next day. Within a week of receiving Pastor Adebayo's acceptance, construction crews arrived at St. Matthew's Anglican Church, but these weren't ordinary workers. They were some of the best contractors in Lagos, using top quality materials and state-of-the-art equipment. The project manager, a professional woman named Engineer Adebisi, explained that the foundation had spared no expense. The new building would be earthquake resistant, solar powered, and equipped with modern amenities, including air conditioning, professional sound systems, and facilities for the disabled. "This will be one of the most beautiful churches in Lagos," she promised Pastor Adebayo. "The foundation's architect has designed something truly special." As the weeks passed, word of the construction spread throughout the community. People came from miles around to see the magnificent building taking shape. The design was breathtaking, a soaring structure that combined traditional African architectural elements with modern engineering. But the most remarkable feature was the community service wing, a separate section that included a medical clinic, a feeding center for the homeless, classrooms for adult education, and dormitories for orphan children. Pastor Adebayo began to feel uneasy about these provisions. "This is more than a church," he complained to Engineer Adebisi. "It is becoming a social service center." Those were the foundation specific requirements. She replied firmly, the building must serve the entire community, especially those most in need. As the construction neared completion, Pastor Adebayo tried repeatedly to contact the Adewale Foundation directly. He wanted to thank his benefactors personally and perhaps suggest some modifications to the community service areas. But all his calls were redirected to secretaries who politely told him that the foundation's board preferred to remain anonymous until the official dedication ceremony. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for a Sunday morning in November 2014. The new St. Matthew's Anglican Church was completed and it was magnificent. A gleaming structure that looked like a cathedral with beautiful stained glass windows, polished marble floors, and seating for over 500 people. Word of the ceremony had spread throughout Lagos. The Anglican bishop had agreed to officiate. Government officials were planning to attend, and several media outlets had announced they could cover the event. Pastor Adebayo was nervous but excited. This was his moment of triumph, proof that God had blessed his ministry with a miracle. He had prepared a special sermon about divine providence and the mysterious ways of the Lord. The church was packed that morning. The original congregation sat in the front rows, amazed by their beautiful new surroundings. Behind them were hundreds of visitors, curious community members, and church officials from across the region. As the service began, Pastor Adebayo noticed an unusual number of poor people in the congregation: street children, market traders, domestic workers, and unemployed youth had somehow heard about the ceremony and come to see the new church. He was slightly annoyed by their presence. Their worn clothes and humble appearance seemed out of place in such a magnificent setting, but with so many important visitors present, he couldn't ask them to leave. The service proceeded beautifully. The choir sounded magnificent in the acoustically perfect sanctuary. The Bible readings echoed clearly through the professional sound system, and Pastor Adebayo's sermon was well received by the distinguished audience. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for: the formal dedication and the revelation of the mysterious benefactor. Bishop Adeyemi took the pulpit and began the dedication prayer. As he blessed the new building, a man in an expensive suit entered through the back doors and walked slowly down the center aisle. He was tall and distinguished, probably in his late 20s, with a confident bearing that commanded attention. His suit was clearly tailored, his shoes were polished to perfection, and he carried himself like someone accustomed to success. But there was something familiar about his face. Pastor Adebayo squinted, trying to place where he might have seen this man before. Other members of the original congregation were also staring, sensing something they couldn't quite identify. The man reached the front of the church and stood quietly to the side as Bishop Adeyemi completed the dedication prayer. And now, the bishop announced, I have the great honor of introducing the benefactor who has made this miracle possible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tade Adewale, founder and chairman of the Adewale Foundation. The name hit Pastor Adebayo like a lightning bolt. Tade Adewale, the same name as the boy they had thrown out 20 years ago. But surely it couldn't be. The distinguished man stepped forward to the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice was strong and clear. Thank you, Bishop Adeyemi. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Tade Adewale, and 20 years ago, I made a promise in this very place. Pastor Adebayo's legs nearly gave out beneath him. The face had changed, matured into manhood, but the eyes were the same. Those were the eyes of the broken 9-year-old boy he had cast out in anger and disgust. Some of you may remember me. Tade continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the original congregation. I was the orphan who lived here as a child, the boy who was told he didn't belong in God's house. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The original members sat in shocked silence, their faces pale with recognition and fear. 20 years ago, Tade continued, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent church. I stood in this place as a broken child and made a promise. I said that one day I would return and build a church where no child would ever be turned away, where the poor would be welcomed and the broken would find healing. He paused, letting his words sink in as he looked directly at Pastor Adebayo. Today, that promise is fulfilled. Pastor Adebayo found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Tade, is it really you? Yes, Pastor Adebayo, it is me. The street rats you threw out, the burden you were tired of carrying, the cause you blamed for all your problems. The church was absolutely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of the moment. I want you all to know, Tade continued, that I didn't build this church for revenge. I built it because I learned something from my years on the streets that I never learned in 20 years of church services. He turned to face the full congregation, including the many poor people who had come to see the ceremony. I learned that God's love isn't limited to those who can afford nice clothes or make large donations. I learned that Jesus himself was homeless, rejected and despised by the religious leaders of his time. And I learned that true faith is measured not by what we have, but by how we treat those who have nothing. Tears were flowing freely now throughout the church. Even some of the distinguished visitors were wiping their eyes. This church started gesture to the beautiful building around them. This church is not just a place of worship. It is a covenant, a promise that no child will ever be turned away from these doors, that the hungry will be fed, the homeless will find shelter, and the broken will find healing. He walked closer to Pastor Adebayo, who was now openly weeping. Pastor, you taught me a valuable lesson 20 years ago, though not the one you intended. You taught me that the church is not a building and faith is not by appearances. You taught me that sometimes God's greatest work happens outside these walls, in the streets and slums where people truly need hope. Pastor Adebayo tried to speak, but his voice was choked with tears. Tade, we were wrong, so terribly wrong. Can you ever forgive us? Tade's expression softened. Pastor, forgiveness is why I am here. Not just to fulfill a promise, but to show that God's love is greater than our failures, that his grace can transform even our worst moments into something beautiful. He turned back to the congregation, but this comes with a responsibility. This church now belongs to the entire community, rich and poor, young and old, those in fine clothes and those in rags. If you cannot worship alongside the least of this, then you have not understood the gospel at all. The ceremony continued, but it was no longer just a building dedication. It had become a moment of profound repentance and renewal. Many of the original congregation members approached Tade after the service, tearfully asking for forgiveness. Some, like Deacon Johnson, had always felt guilty about how they had treated him. Others were genuinely shocked to realize how cruel they had been to a child. But the most powerful moment came when a small group of street children who had been watching from the back of the church approached Tade shyly. "Brother Tade," one of them said, "na true say we fit come here anytime?" Tade knelt down to their level, just as someone should have done for him 20 years earlier. "Yes," he said, his voice gentle and warm. "This is your house too. You're always welcome here." As the sun set over Lagos that evening, the new St. Matthew's Anglican Church stood as more than just a building. It was a testament to the power of redemption, the reality of second chances, and the truth that God's love can transform even the deepest pain into purpose. Pastor Adebayo, humbled and changed by the day's events, preached his first sermon in the new church that evening. His text was from Matthew 25:40. "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." And in the front row, listening with rapt attention, sat a group of street children who finally had a place where they belonged. Tade Adewale had kept his promise, but more than that, he had shown that sometimes the children we cast aside are the very ones God chooses to become his greatest servants. The orphan had returned home, and in doing so, he had transformed not just a building, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to follow Christ. Remember, family, that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The child you overlook today might be the leader who changes our world tomorrow. Treat everyone with kindness, because you never know when you might be entertaining angels unaware. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart. Subscribe to Raw Tales Africa for more inspiring content, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Until next time, keep believing in the power of true love and redemption.